To another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And we are continuing our series learning about Hegel with these half-hour Hegel series by Dr. Sadler. And I'll jump right into it. Got some 30-minute episode, 34 minutes episode to go through. So let's just jump into it. So my description of the last sections 81 to 83, or part 36 of the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit. I say Hegel introduces an apparent contradiction with science as consciousness tries to understand reality by relating to it. That means it necessarily separates itself from the truth of reality. That means that the other, i.e., the truth, is something that exists in itself, while the tools we use to understand it, that is, knowledge, is for itself. Consciousness may not be able to fully grasp all of reality, therefore, we do not have complete knowledge. But we can grasp all of our own knowledge and therefore constantly update our own ability to know the truth. Because consciousness holds within itself the ability or desire to know things, it also therefore holds its own criteria for what we know. Those criteria can and will be updated as we update our knowledge and get ever closer to the truth of all things. So, yeah, that's how I summarize the last section. Let's see how Dr. Sadler did it. He says, in these paragraphs, Hegel begins by examining the need for some type of standard or criterion that will be used in the course of the investigation. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. What sort of criterion could be applicable when the science is one in the process of being worked out? Attention to the nature and development of consciousness clarifies this matter, since consciousness relates itself through knowing to objects. Yeah, making them for consciousness, but also positions that they retain something of being in itself beyond consciousness. That's a good, context to remember. And yet, the investigation is not only extends to the in itself of objects, but also examines knowledge as it is in itself, the being of or truth of knowing. This also reveals that knowledge is for us, for consciousness, and so the criterion we are seeking is not only within the object, the in itself, it also resides within consciousness. Yeah. I ain't gonna lie. I think my explanation was a little bit better on that one. I don't know, Dr. Sadler. A little bit confusing there. I mean, maybe that's just the problem of like this in itself, for itself, and consciousness and for us and all this other stuff. I don't know. It confuses me, so I try to steer clear of that a little bit. But yeah, this is great. Just kind of needle it in a little bit. Let's get into it. Share my screen. And here we go.
But the dissociation, or this semblance of dissociation and presupposition, is overcome by the nature of the object we are investigating. Consciousness provides its own criterion from within itself, so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness with itself, for the distinction made above falls within it. In consciousness, one thing exists for another. That is, consciousness regularly contains the determinateness of the moment of knowledge. At the same time, this other is to consciousness not merely for it, but is also outside of the relationship or exists in itself, the moment of truth. Thus, in what consciousness affirms from within itself as being in itself, or the true, we have the standard by which consciousness itself sets up by which to measure what it knows. If we designate knowledge as the notion, but the essence or the true as what exists, or the object, then the examination consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds to the object. But if we call the essence or in itself of the object the notion, and on the other hand understand by the object the notion itself as object, that is, as it exists for another, then the examination consists in seeing whether the object corresponds to its notion. It is evident, of course, that the two procedures are actually the same. But the essential point to bear in mind throughout our whole investigation is that these two moments, notion and object, being for another, being for itself, Both fall within that knowledge which we are investigating. Consequently, we do not need to import criteria or to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of the inquiry. It is precisely when we leave these aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter in hand as it is in and for itself.
Okay. I think what he's saying here is like, you can kind of set like an idea of like, okay, what is a cup? All right. There's kind of three ways of looking at it, I suppose, right? Of trying to figure out what is a cup. You can say, okay, I'm going to look at it, this cup for what it is, right? And then try to define a cup by what I see here. That's the notion as, the object, right? As its own notion, right? This is for itself. And so you're trying to see what it is. Or you can look at it internally, kind of say, okay, what what a cup seems to be, right? And my concept of a cup is something that blah 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 blah, right? So you're still describing what you're seeing, like the object and everything like that, but you're more focused on the notion of that object, of what the cup seems to be to you, as opposed to what the cup is for itself. Um, Versus setting a criterion, which is like, okay, a cup should be something that you can hold, something that you can put stuff into, something like you. Instead of you setting these rules for what you think a cup should be, instead, you just look at what it is, and then either look at it for the object that it is, or the idea of what you think it is, and then from there you can form a better kind of understanding of what it is than trying to set these criteria of like, okay, it should do this, that, and the other, and then seeing, okay, is there anything that does this, that, and the other, right? Because if you set these criteria, if you set these things for it should do this, that, and the other, then your problem is like, where'd you come up with these things, right? You had to do this first anyways, right? You still had to look at a cup and decide, okay, what does a cup do? You still had to think about the concept of a cup and do all this other stuff before you even came up with the criterion. So it's kind of redundant to even make the criterion. And by making that criterion, you're leading yourself into more problems, because eventually you're going to put in more stuff that doesn't actually have to be in there, right? Or you might just come up with stuff that isn't really come from these observations or notions of things and stuff. At least that's how I see it right now. I might be completely wrong. I don't know. Let's see.
Hegel begins section 84 by telling us that what we're really dealing with here is not actually the sort of conundrum that we thought that we had, with consciousness and its own criterion for its knowledge on one side, and the object, the in itself, the truth of what it is that we're trying to seek out on the other, so that we have subject and object, or subject and world, or even subject and other person. He says that what we've got here is a semblance, a shine, an appearance of dissociation, Trennung, splitting, well, that'd be more Spaltung, slicing, and presupposition, for Aussetzung, something that we're setting out beforehand. These are only in appearance. Why? Because there's something that's going on that we haven't taken stock of yet in all of what we've been doing. And it's so obvious once it's pointed out that you're likely to say, oh, how did I not notice that? It's also a move which is going to really stress the idealism that Hegel is identified with. So let's go back to what we had. We have an object of knowing, and we call this the in itself, the being in itself. Hegel says that truth, in some sense, lies on the side of the object. And how does consciousness relate itself to it? Through knowing. And so knowing is, in a certain sense, a penetration into the object from something that is not the object, something that differentiates itself from it. And we were saying, well, how do we know that the knowledge is actually knowledge? How do we know the truth of the knowledge? And that entailed moving from the in itself of knowledge to the realization that knowledge itself is something for consciousness, that knowledge can also become an object. And when we're trying to talk about the in itself of knowledge, we're already treating it like an object, at the same time that we're using it as part of our subjectivity. So Hegel says the criterion lies within consciousness. Now, he's not saying that it lies within every single one of us as a completely infallible, totally reliable guide. He's not appealing to something like intuition or feeling. This is going to be something that has to be developed and assured. But there is something within us, he's saying, that does give us some standard that we can use. And we come to a conflict. We have a standard here and a standard here. How do we get out of this? How do we show that this is actually not the case? He goes on and he says, so consciousness provides its own criterion from within itself. The investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness with itself. Consciousness uses that very criterion to compare itself with itself, which means that when we think about what consciousness is, we need to think about consciousness as encompassing all of this knowing and also encompassing this comparison. And now notice what we're doing. I'm doing this graphically, but you have to do this through thought. That's what Hegel's after here. Consciousness encompasses more than we originally thought it did. That's the key point here. Consciousness encompasses more than we, i.e. consciousness, thought it did. Consciousness is becoming conscious of the fact that consciousness is more than it took itself to be. See what's going on there? So he goes on. And he says, in consciousness, one thing exists for another. That is, consciousness contains the determinateness of the moment of knowledge. That's what's going on here, right? At the same time, this other is to consciousness not merely for it, but is also outside of this relationship or exists in itself. So far, so good. So we've got consciousness, which is bigger than it realized it was, and now that it's paying closer attention to itself by doing phenomenological investigation, it realizes that it's really encompassing quite a lot, but there's still this other lying outside of it, in itself, the moment of truth. So he says, thus, in what consciousness affirms from within being as being in itself for the true, we have the standard which consciousness sets up by which to measure what it knows. What does that mean? Here's what it means. This is actually the same thing as this. The criterion that is in consciousness of its knowing for knowledge of what is not consciousness is this thing over here that seems to be in itself. Now, doesn't that promote a sort of skepticism? We don't know it's over here. So now we just imported otherness and alterity and a blank knowing and nothing into the middle of consciousness. Or did we? Haven't we been carrying out this entire procedure in terms of consciousness? Through consciousness? Doesn't the in itself exist as in itself? Not only for consciousness, but in the realm of consciousness. So he says, if we designate knowledge as the notion, but the essence or the true as what exists or the object, then the examination consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds to the object. So we can go from this to this and see if they correspond. Here's the notion, here's the object. But you know what? Because this is all within consciousness, we can also flip it around. We can put the notion on this side, and we can put the object on this side. We can use this as the measure. He says, if we call the essence or in itself of the object the notion, on the other hand, understand by the object the notion itself as object, as it exists for an other, for consciousness, for us, then the examination consists in seeing whether the object corresponds to its notion. So does the notion correspond to its object? Does the object correspond to its notion? Is there a disharmony between the two of them? Generally, there's going to be some disjunction between them until the entire circuit of phenomenal consciousness has been brought into one expansive, systematic, fully cognizant whole. So he says, it's evident these two procedures are the same. The essential point to bear in mind throughout the whole investigation is that these two moments, notion and object, being for another and being in itself, both fall within that knowledge which we are investigating. So, whether we want to call this, subject and this object, or notion and object, or knowledge and truth, or we want to flip them around, it's all within the domain of consciousness. Now that doesn't mean that it's within the domain of any one individual consciousness, but we're finding out that this problem of skepticism about whether we can truly understand, know, appropriate things turns out to be a boogeyman. It says, so we don't need to import criteria. We've already got the criteria. He says, we don't need to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of the inquiry. It's precisely when we leave these aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter at hand as it is, and now we're fusing things together, in and for itself. Now, what does that mean? That means that if we're doing phenomenology, we need to be paying attention to what's over here and allowing that to actually be the criterion for the investigation as we're carrying it out as consciousness. There's a process of going back and forth between these two, and we don't need to bring in some things from the outside. We don't need a presupposition because we already have something that is vorausgesetzt. We already have something that is out there for us, and we assume that it's out there for us as something other, something opposed, something that we need to get to know, not realizing that it's already out there for us in our consciousness, in the consciousness that's been developed through the historical process.
That was fantastic. I was thinking so many things as I was listening to that. And I should have went back and reread, that first part. Because I honestly wasn't even paying super much attention. That happens almost every time when I start these videos. It's like my brain takes a few minutes to catch up. But yeah, I'm mad I missed that part because that is a huge part, and it speaks a lot into what we've been learning more and more about, like physics and neuroscience and stuff like that. Is that when we look at what consciousness is, right? It seems to require some idea of like self and some idea of like other things. And this is super important, right? Because as so far as we can tell, many other animals and things in the world, have some perception of the world, but we don't know to what extent that they are aware, right, of the world outside of themselves. As in, we don't seem to see very much evidence of them, of other creatures kind of, acting upon the world like we do, right? Because they seem to act kind of reactively. However, we are seeing certain animals, right, like elephants, dolphins, and things like that, have behaviors in which they do seem to have this idea that there's a separation between themselves and the world, right? So we could say maybe they have some level of consciousness. And this is why other people might say, "Oh, there's other levels of consciousness." Maybe there is. Maybe the consciousness is about like the level, right? The um like a certain threshold, right? But either way, for us, for humans, right? When we say we're being conscious or conscious of something, what we're saying is that we're perceiving the world in a way that is constantly what's the term I want to use here, kind of back and forth, right? Like there's a communication, there's a back and forth that happens when we look at an object, because there's like instantly, as soon as you look at an object, you're constantly, you're thinking, oh, what is that? That's this. Is it real? Is this blah blah blah, right? So you kind of having this back and forth, and that's why I really like the idea of like your consciousness kind of goes beyond just what you think of as an interior, right? It is the very fact that we can perceive something different. We can perceive like this cup, right? The idea of a cup, even though we say it's outside of ourselves, it requires a conscious thought to even perceive a cup, right? As a cup, rather than just ourselves, rather than just, I'm looking for food and then boom, I'm fed and whatever, right? Like it's hard for us to even conceive of a world in which we're not conscious. That's another hard part about this. And so therefore, pretty much every way in which we perceive the world requires conscious thought, requires this conscious, action. And so to say that we can't know the world is kind of like to say we can't be conscious of the world. Like we already are conscious. We already are knowing the world. The question is not can we know it? The question is, how do we know it? Like how can we know more? How can we keep this going essentially and grow this? I don't know if any of that made sense, but I don't know. To me, that was really powerful. This idea of just like the conscious, how the consciousness kind of incorporates more than just this initial idea, but also like the very knowledge that we have and the object for itself. Yeah, that's just dope.
But not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion and what is to be tested, are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them. So that, since what consciousness examines is its own self, all that is left for us to do is simply look on. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself. Right. Consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. Since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness is itself their comparison. It is for the same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. The object, it
Again, this is powerful. Like, right, it's going into that, the very act of knowing things, the very act of being conscious of things has this back and forth, has this, setting up a criterion and looking at it and stuff like that. So you don't really need a separate idea, right? Because just the act of living, right? Just the act of being conscious of a thing enables you and requires you really to have to have this setup to look at this object for what it is, for what you think the truth is, and all this other stuff, and then for you to kind of look back at that to say, oh, is that really the truth? Is that really how I understand it?
is true seems only to be for consciousness in the way that consciousness knows it. It seems that consciousness cannot, as it were, get behind the object as it exists for consciousness, so as to examine what the object itself, and hence too cannot test its own knowledge by that standard. But the distinction between the in itself and knowledge is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all.
Right.
Something is for it the in itself, and knowledge, or the being of the object for consciousness, is for it another moment. Upon this distinction, which is present as a fact, the examination rests. If the comparison is present, if the comparison shows that these two moments do not correspond to one another, it would seem that consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. But in fact, in the alteration of the knowledge, the object itself alters for it too. For the knowledge that was present was essentially a knowledge of the object. As the knowledge changes, so too does the object, for it essentially belonged to this knowledge. Hence,
Right. This is why when you look at something in a different light, right, that forever changes how you look at that thing. It forever changes what that object is to you, right? If again this cup, right? If I say, "Oh, what is this cup?" If I say this cup is a weapon because I can hit you in the head and kill you with it, right? Like now you're always going to be thinking like, "Oh, yes, this cup is also a weapon, right? Yes, it is a cup. It's also a weapon, right?" And this is a very simple idea of it, but the point here is that when you reincorporate knowledge, when you reincorporate a different perception of a thing, a different way of seeing that thing, that new perception becomes that thing, right? The thing is reincorporated as like this new idea of what you thought it was. So it's not like that there is some separate idea of truth and knowledge outside of yourself or outside of us as conscious people, and we have to figure out how we get there, or maybe there is, but the point of us being conscious is that just the fact that we can know things and see things and everything like that, means that what we see as the truth, it becomes the truth, right? And this is why it's also so important to always update our knowledge and our understanding of the world, because what you think to be true is the truth for you at that moment, right? Even though it might not be true for other people or other parts of society or whatever. And so it requires more and more people to do this inquiry, to expand that knowledge, or else we can very easily get to a point where we lose knowledge and we lose this understanding of what the world can be, not because we lost, not because the world can't be that, but because we don't know it anymore. Like we don't think it's possible. We don't, we're not really thinking about it anymore. And I think that's where he's gonna go more or less in some of the ways he's doing some of the things he was talking about in terms of the stages of consciousness and throughout different history and things like that. I think that's where he's going here. I might be wrong, but we'll see. This is my prediction.
it comes to pass for consciousness that what it previously took to be the in itself is not an in itself, or that is only an in itself for consciousness. Since consciousness thus finds that its knowledge does not correspond to its object, the object itself does not stand the test. In other words, the criterion for testing is altered when that for which it was to have been the criterion fails to pass the test. And the testing is not only a testing of what we know, but also a testing of the criterion of what knowing is.
What we think we can know, how we can know. Beautiful. That's amazing.
Hegel is now able to bring together these different movements and themes so that we can understand what it is that we're doing in phenomenology, in a phenomenology of spirit, of consciousness as it develops through time. And he's going to use consciousness in a sort of double way here, one in which it is essentially passive in how it seems, but its truest activity is actually contemplative. And he talks about just watching, just looking on, reiner Zusehen. just observing. What does consciousness observe? So we need to follow this out. There's a lot of twists and turns in this. He says, we don't need to make a contribution. We can be just observers. It would be superfluous. Why? Because notion and object, criterion and what are to be tested, are present in consciousness itself. But we're also spared the trouble of testing them. Now, what does that mean, that we're spared the trouble of testing them? Well, does that mean that consciousness itself is purely passive, just sits back and accepts the results? In a sense, the consciousness of the present does that with what consciousness has already carried out in the past. And much of what we're doing in the phenomenology is reappropriating what has gone on through the activity, through the thinking, through the struggle of the past. That has to do with correspondence between notion and object, criterion, and what is assessed. So he says, what consciousness examines is really its own self. All that's left to do is simply look on, just watch, just observe. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other hand, consciousness is consciousness of self. And it goes without saying that in being consciousness of both object and consciousness of self, since consciousness is of the object, it is also of the relationship between itself and the object. And this could be, spelled out in many more complex ways, and will once we get to concrete determinateness and start thinking about distinctive stages in the development of spirit. But this suffices for right now. So we have consciousness, the object, and we know that knowledge is something that really matters here. So he says, consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself. Consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. So we have knowledge and truth, the in itself, the process of for another, for consciousness. And he says, since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness itself is their comparison. Why can consciousness just sort of look on? Because all of this is actually taking place within the extent of consciousness, and it doesn't have to carry out an active process of comparing these, because they're already comparing themselves against each other, or they've already done so. So he says, this consciousness is itself the comparison. It is for the same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. What is the connection between these two? Consciousness grasps that. Now he's presenting it here as if it takes place in a very immediate way. And if that were so simple, then we just have to snap our fingers and be already at page, whatever, in the very last section of absolute knowing. Obviously, it's going to take a bit more than that, but this is the outline of what's going on. So he says, the object, it's true, seems to be for consciousness in the way that consciousness knows it. So there's the object as it is for us in knowledge, and then there's the in itself. And that's why I put the verses here, right? But as we saw, this in itself also falls within consciousness. It is not truly in itself. It seems that way. He says, it seems that consciousness cannot, as it were, get behind the object as it exists for consciousness. And so as to examine what the object is in itself. And so it cannot test its own knowledge by that standard. And here we might want to think about examples of this. We can talk about the fact that I can't truly know what this piece of chalk is in and of itself. There's always something within it that's resisting and eluding my knowledge of it. Even if I learn all the chemistry of it, that's fine. I don't have in mind that sort of thing. What I'm thinking of is more along the lines of, how do you get to know a person? Consciousness, myself. Object, you. Knowledge, I know you. I don't just mean acquaintance. I mean that if I get to know you, say in the form of a friendship over time, there's things that I come to know, a whole history, I can coalesce all these things into a person, into an image that I have of you. Is it possible for me to be mistaken? Sure. Do I have to revise what it is that I think I'm encountering in that object? Yeah. Might you have sides to you that I totally, have no clue about, that I don't suspect exist? Possible. Could that be the case for ourselves?
Yep.
Could we be an object for ourselves in that way? See, there we start to get into things that are a little bit more sticky than my relation to a piece of chalk, don't we? But that's the sort of thing that he's talking about. Now think about my relationship to great historical ideas. What is freedom? Do I fully understand the notion of freedom? Treating that object as a notion. Or is my knowledge of it to some degree inadequate? Is there sides to it that I can't actually fully know? Is something that always eludes me about it? Perhaps. But where does that eluding fall in? Who can worry about that? Consciousness. Consciousness encompasses the very skeptical doubts about whether it knows the in itself. So he says, the distinction between the in itself and knowledge is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all. Relationality, being able to be connected to something outside of yourself, already presupposes this dialectic between object and knowledge within consciousness. So he says, upon this distinction, which is present as a fact, the examination rests. If the comparison shows that these two moments don't correspond to one another, if my knowledge doesn't correspond to the object as I come to know it, then I got to fix my knowledge, right? I've got to adjust what's going on here. Now, notice too that there's a converse to this that's very important. He says, in fact, in the alteration of the knowledge, the object alters as well. When we change how we relate to other things, we actually change our consciousness of those other things in the process, and oftentimes is revealed to us that they are different than we thought. We get to know a friend better, and we find out that they're not that much of a friend at all. And we get to know somebody else who's not a friend, and we realize they're a wonderful person. Our knowledge reveals to us that the object was not quite what we took it for to begin with. That's how we acquire more and more adequate knowledge. So he says, then as the knowledge changes, so does the object, for it essentially belong to this knowledge. Hence it comes to pass for consciousness that what it previously took to be the in itself is not an in itself. It's an in itself for consciousness. It is not a true in itself. Since consciousness thus finds its knowledge does not correspond to its object, what knowledge? The knowledge of what it is to be in itself. The object itself does not stand the test. In other words, the criterion for testing is altered when that for which it was to have been the criterion fails to pass the test. When what's being assessed fails, the criterion itself gets called into question. It says the testing is not only a testing of what we know, but also a testing of the criterion itself. How do we bring all these together? We've got a lot of things spilled out on this board. So what's really going on here is all this process of what consciousness is realizing going on within its own purview. And this has been going on for a long time, long enough for consciousness to have arrived at the point where it can be fully conscious of all that's past. That's what Hegel's after here.
Great stuff, man.
Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it this dialectical movement which consciousness exercises on itself and which affects both its knowledge and its object is precisely what is called experience. In this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned which must be brought out more clearly, for through it a new light will be thrown on the exposition which follows. Consciousness knows something. This object is the essence or the in itself, but it is also for consciousness the in itself. This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself. The second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself. That is, what consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only its knowledge of that first object. But, as was shown previously, the first object in being known is altered for consciousness. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. And this then is the true, the being for consciousness of this in itself. Or, in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it.
Let me back up.
What experience consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience of consciousness in itself only for consciousness. And this then is the true, the being for consciousness of this in itself. Or, in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it. Here in section 86, Hegel reintroduces a very important term that we want to take some cognizance of. And I'm going to dwell a little bit, I don't do this very often, but I'm going to dwell a little bit on the lexicality of it, the very, meaning of the term as we unpack it in its native German. So erfahrung, fahren means to travel along some sort of path or trajectory. And in a certain way, it also means to take a ride. And that's what's going on in the phenomenology.
German language is pretty crazy, man. Seems to have these really cool words for really interesting experiences. So I like that. And sad we don't really have that much stuff like that, like singular words for that. We just have to, phrase it through a whole sentence.
We're studying experiences, and we often think of experience as just something that impinges upon us. We think about our life experiences or the experiential versus the cognitive, and we make these sort of distinctions. And the way that Hegel's using the term, that doesn't really work. For one thing, we're talking about the experience of consciousness. I think a lot of people fall into the trap. This is a little bit of a soapbox here, but it's very useful for understanding Hegel or for understanding philosophy in general. A lot of people fall in the trap of talking about their what's experiential versus what's abstract or cognitive or discursive or what have you. And we can make that distinction. There is something there to say, well, you haven't experienced it yourself, so therefore you don't know about it. But what sets us apart as human beings from the other animals is the very fact that we're able to share experiences.
Exactly.
And I don't mean to share in the sense of you and I are on the same river raft adventure together. What I mean is that I can write about it, and you can read about it, or I can shoot a video about it and talk to you about it, and you can imagine it. And you can imagine it if I have wonderful powers of expression, which I don't have as a novelist. You can imagine it in detail. You can bring to it your own experiences and fill it out. So that's one aspect. The other thing is, thinking itself is an action. Contemplation produces experience. It's not as if we have our world of experience over here, and then we have what we do in philosophy over here.
Yeah.
Philosophy itself involves an experience, but an experience is something that should, in fact, inspire, at least to some degree in us, at some times, wonder. And it should provoke a curiosity. Perhaps a sense of the discordance of things. Those are all experiences, according to Hegel. So what we're talking about here is this progression of experiences. And he says, if we think about what's going on, this dialectical movement that consciousness exercises on itself, and which affects both its knowledge and its object, this is what consciousness is doing. Consciousness, as we just said a little bit earlier, consciousness is doing more than it's conscious of doing, and we want to explore that thematically. This entire dialectic is what we call experience. In this connection, he says, there's a moment in the process just mentioned which must be brought out more clearly. So that's what this section is about, this particular moment. Through it, a new light will be shed on the exposition that follows. So we want to pay attention here, right? Consciousness knows something. The object is the essence or the in itself. But we've already gone over this, right? So we have consciousness, and consciousness, through knowledge, knows the object or the in itself. So far, so good. And it's also for consciousness the in itself. So we saw that consciousness encompasses all of this, right? He says, this is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. The object becomes double. Is it the same object, or is it two different objects? That's what's going on here that he wants to call our attention to. And he's going to make some real use of that in the next paragraph. But first we want to dwell on this. Why do we have two objects here? How does that make sense? Where did this extra object come from? Well, we started out with the object as the in itself or the essence. And then we realized that since it was encompassed, it was in itself for consciousness. And this is part of what got us over our worries about, what about those in itselfs that I can't access out there? So, well, consciousness actually, and even posing that problem is making that a problem for consciousness. It's bringing it within consciousness's ambit or purview. But this isn't the same as this. These are two distinct moments within consciousness. And we've moved from this to this. This, as he says, reveals the nullity of the original object. And going back to just the previous passages when we talked about this correspondence between knowledge and object, and realizing that maybe knowledge and object don't map onto each other that well, or notion and object don't map onto each other that well. When we change the one side, we also change the other side. So if we're losing something here, we're also losing something over here. And we're introducing negativity once again into consciousness in a very straightforward way. He says, consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself, the second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself. What consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only knowledge, right, of the first object. Maybe that's all this really is. But it's not. He says, here we go. As was shown previously, the first object in being known is being changed for consciousness. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. And this then is the truth. This is the truth that we're seeking. The being for consciousness of this in itself. Or in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. The new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it.
Mm.
So what does experience mean? For Hegel, part of what it means is realizing that what we thought we knew, as we got to know it better, as we started to take stock of our own relation to it and our own contribution to creating that object, as we brought it into the purview of consciousness explicitly, we experience it differently. Mm-hmm. And part of experience includes the discordance between one experience and the other. We can talk of experience in the terms of like one single experience, little punctual points, but we can also talk about experience as something broader. We're able to have experiences of not having experienced, of having experienced, of remembering an experience, of misremembering an experience. All of these are possible. So this is what he means by experience. Getting to know the truth of what it is that we've engaged ourselves with, mm-hmm. by realizing that we ourselves are involved in the process of constituting what it is that we're thinking to be true. We're building truth. We're uncovering truth. We're engaged in truth in the very process. Truth is not something totally outside of us.
Mm. Goodness. That's a lot of great stuff right there. And yes, I was getting a little sleepy, not because of the dark satellite. I was just long morning, doing a lot of stuff, and I'm about to let my brain digest this stuff. But yeah, a lot of fantastic things there. Like I said, I really like that idea. The fact that, just the act of being conscious of a thing means that you're already thinking about what that thing is, right? It's not like you're trying to like, oh yeah, this is the ultimate truth. But you can only see what you see, right? You can only perceive and think about how we think about things as a species, as a conscious agent, and in so doing, right, we have this idea of what it is that we think we're thinking about, that we think we're looking at, that we think we know, and as we update that knowledge, right, as we update that relationship, that understanding, that thing itself becomes something different than what we thought it was. Because we don't know what the truth is, right? It's like you have this idea, you have this thing out there that you don't really know what it is. You see different parts of it, right? And when you see more of it, you can't say that the thing changed. It's your perception of the thing changed. So maybe there was this over thing, but you see this part, right? So the objects that you see are still these objects, still these ideas, still these things, but they change for you, right? And furthermore, again, we can't even say that there's objective things out there, right? So maybe that that analogy didn't play out real. That wasn't a good way to visualize it. But yeah, I think this is a very powerful section here. Probably going to listen to it again before I get into the next one. But that's great. I'm excited. As always, let me know what you think, what you learned about this part or whatever, and have a great day. Keep learning, keep being awesome, and see ya. Bye bye.